Hey everybody, welcome to Grubstakers, the podcast about billionaires. This week we're talking about the Koch brothers on a special two-part investigation. In part one, we talk about their origin stories, as well as how Fred Koch struck some lucrative deals with two gentlemen named Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler. We also talk about Charles and David Koch's early flirtations with the radical libertarian movement and their funding of various schools that promote Southern secession. All that and more coming up on Grubstakers.
I think we disproportionately stop whites too much.
I taught those kids lessons on product development and marketing, and they taught me what it was like growing up feeling targeted for your race.
I am proud to be gay. I am proud to be a Republican.
You know, I went to a tough school in Queens, and they used to beat up the little Jewish boys.
You know, I love having the support of real billionaires.
All right, you can stop that, Andy. I got to do the intro now. Hey, everybody. Welcome to a very special episode of Grubstakers. Sean P. McCarthy here, as always, with the friends.
Andy Palmer.
Steve Jeffers.
Yogi Polywalt.
And this is a special episode about the Koch brothers. You might have heard of them. And, if you're a critical listener to our podcast, you might think that this is just, four open micers doing Wikipedia research. And to that I say, first of all, Andy has not been to an open mic in months. Second of all, today it's a special episode because I read a book.
Yes, that's
I read
right.
460 pages of Dark Money by Jane Mayer.
Wow.
Yeah. And so I know a lot about the Koch brothers. So today, it's not going to be 2 hours of frantic Googling and then plagiarizing other people's work and adding bad jokes to it. It will be one book that we're plagiarizing and adding bad jokes and audio drops to.
And it's extra impressive because Sean is functionally illiterate.
He's the R. Kelly of our group in more ways than one.
But so, yeah.
We're not allowed to talk about him anymore.
Yeah.
Sean?
And I was going to say, we don't have time to do research because I have spent all of my life trying to find Kurt Cobain's accusations of statutory rape to get him pulled off Spotify to annoy Andy. It's like, it's not so much for the victims, it's for irritating Andy.
I mean, it is the victims because Andy is a victim. Let's be honest here.
But so basically, we should mention, because we're going to be doing this special two-part episode on the Koch brothers. This is part one of two. And because it is the Koch brothers, we might have some more liberals listening. And we would just like to welcome you if you're a new listener. And this is a podcast about how the Koch brothers are the only bad billionaires. All of the other ones are good.
They're pretty great, actually.
Yeah. But the Koch brothers have become kind of a fixture, since Harry Reid talked about them on the Senate floor and Obama has spoken about them, and for good reason. But they have become kind of a fixture of the liberal hatred of billionaires, and they're a very fascinating group. And I think like one of the best ways to start this is just to talk about the 2016 election. Hillary Clinton and affiliated PACs spent about $1.4 billion in 2016. Trump and his PAC spent about $950 million. The Koch brothers network spent more than $889 million. So essentially, when you put those three together, you can think about the Koch brothers network as a third political party in America. They have, to a great extent, co-opted the Republican Party. In fact, in, I think, 2015, the Republican Party has started sharing their voter data with the Koch brothers network. So, I mean, it's very much a hostile takeover.
Right.
What Sean's not mentioning is that the Koch networks, the money they spent was all from small donations.
My question is, as a third political party, what's their mascot? We got the elephant, we got the donkey. What's this group's animal?
Burning teenagers.
It's the
More
oil,
on that later.
The oil refinery their father set up in Nazi Germany.
I feel like it's a dinosaur just slowly decomposing. Like the fox decomposing video?
Oh, yeah.
Like that, but then turning into oil. I think that's really what their mascot should be.
Their mascot should be the polar bear, and it slowly gets smaller and smaller every year. But yeah, no, so Koch Industries is the second largest private corporation in the world.
Must have sprung up overnight.
In the world. And it is also one of the top 10 polluters in air, water, and climate.
What?
I believe they dump more than 29 million tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every year. They are the #1 toxic waste producer in the U.S., and also they own Dixie cups and Brawny paper towels and shit.
Yeah,
So-
Dixie cups, the cups you use when you're either dying or about to die.
Or for Jell-O shots.
Jell-O shots? Yeah, I guess that's true too.
I just like the idea of liberal college students having Jell-O shots while unknowingly funneling dark money against the Obama administration. Another interesting thing is when we talk about the Koch brothers, people usually think, rightly, David and Charles Koch. They think there's just 2 brothers. There's actually 4 brothers, and we'll touch on the others briefly. But David and Charles Koch are they're the big names because Forbes, as of 2018, estimates each of them at net worth of about $61.8 billion. They are I think the 4th and 5th richest people in the world. I mean, they are extremely wealthy, and the majority of their net worth comes from each of them owns more than 40% of Koch Industries, which is, as we mentioned, the 2nd largest private corporation in the world.
I mean, I feel like those other brothers think they're just such weak idiots. Just like I don't have $40 billion. I'm not. Anytime they use a Dixie cup, they're just like, I fucked up.
Yeah, that must suck to only be worth $1 billion.
I bet they openly litter, and when people are like, "Hey, you shouldn't litter," and be like, "Trust me, my family is known for this."
All right. Well, so the primary method in which the Koch brothers exercise their influence over the political process are these Koch brothers semi-annual summits. They hold them at various resorts and places like that around the country, and they've been holding 2 of them every year since 2003, which incidentally followed a major settlement, a prosecution of the Koch Industries by the Clinton Department of Justice in 1999, which suddenly gave them an interesting desire to be involved in the mainstream political process. But they've been holding these summits twice annually since 2003. It really, after Obama got elected, is when they really took off. According to Jane Mayer, the author of the book I wrote, more than 18 billionaires attended their January 2009 post-Obama summit.
Sean just said he wrote this book, by the way.
I said I wrote it?
Yeah, you're like, according to this book I wrote. And it's like, Sean, come on, you can't.
Dude, I listen to the tapes and I'm like, is my brain melting? Because last week I said
I don't remember writing this.
Paul Singer. Last week I said Paul Singer founded the Fusion GPS doc instead of funded it, and I'm just like, people are listening to me have a stroke.
Not only are they listening, I listened to it 2 to 3 times.
This is gonna be my mom's gonna confront you guys why didn't you see the warning signs?
I don't know. They were pretty funny.
Oh, we saw them. We just thought we could make money off of them.
Yeah, we wanted to see how far it would go.
Today on Grubstakers, we take it as far as this shit has ever gone.
God, by the end, I'm going to be like, yeah, I dump 29 million tons of carbon into the atmosphere every year. And I built a oil refinery in Nazi Germany. God.
Bonus episode. Sean dies on mic. You can hear his death rattle.
The billionaires. Nas was better than Jay-Z. That's his final words.
But yes, according to this book I wrote, there were 18 billionaires. Jane Mayer's book says that there were more than 18 billionaires and many millionaires at the January 2009 post-Obama Koch Brothers summit. They keep the guest lists and the minutes secret, though occasionally those things have leaked out, which is where our information on these summits comes from. But to kind of understand what they do at these Koch Brothers summits, it's kind of, as we mentioned, they are the 3rd political party. So essentially they get all these billionaires and multimillionaires together and they say, hey, pledge X million dollars and we will distribute it throughout our affiliated networks. And they spread this out through all these different conservative action groups and think tanks such as Cato, Heritage Foundation, and then these PACs like Americans for Prosperity, like Center to Protect Patients' Rights and whatever other bullshit names they come up with. But it's like investment, where essentially these millionaires and billionaires have various regulations they want to fight. They have things they want to stop, things they want to get done. And by donating to the Koch network, they've essentially set up a network to bring a political party that just consists of the millionaires and billionaires in this country into action, and that spends almost as much money as the Republican and Democratic parties.
Well, if I may boot in, there was an article from Time Magazine from this year where they talk about the Koch brothers' most recent summit. They were given access, and they say that the summit actually was able to bring together Senator Ted Cruz, the rapper Scarface, and John Carlos, one of the Olympic medal winners who gave the Black Power salute at the podium. And
at this podium or in the Olympics?
In the Olympics. Yeah, I think he was one of the ones in that famous picture. And so basically they had meetings where they would talk about, taking these new woke stands, like Charles Koch said, we need to be fully committed to a society in which everybody has an opportunity to make a better life for themselves.
Wow.
That's what we're about. And then another person said, let me be frank up front. These elections are going to be brutally tough. They're talking about the upcoming midterms. That's from CEO Emily Seidel. So what are we going to do about it? We've never faced a challenge like this. But then it says...
Except when we built that oil refinery for Adolf Hitler.
That was probably pretty easy if they did it early. The hard thing was keeping the oil coming to that because they couldn't get Ukraine. Anyway.
The hard thing was making sure all of the Jewish personnel were not in the room when they met with the German executives.
But here's the thing. So many of the most enthusiastic conversations stemmed from conversations about how the Koch-based network could change communities. I hate to quote Hillary Clinton, but it takes a village, said Jill Lynch, whose family owns an Iowa agriculture firm. These programs break against the images of the Koch brothers as political villains. Parentheses, former Senate Democratic leader Harry Reid called them, quote, oligarchs during one of his many speeches against them on the Senate floor. In parentheses, and that's part of the point. The Koch brothers network has long insisted that it dallies in politics as a mean to push policy.
Wow.
Fuck you, Time Magazine.
Consider the stage that brought together Cruz, Scarface, and Carlos on Martin Luther King Jr. Day.
Oh, my God.
Each arrived to share his experiences and ideas for fighting what they broadly called inner-city violence. The organizers, the Koch-backed urban specialists, focus on preventing crime, keeping young people from joining gangs, and former Bishop Omar Jawar's words, reforming urban culture. Anyways, at the bottom of this article, it says in parentheses, disclosure, Time Incorporated, Time's parent company, has agreed to be acquired by Meredith Corp. in a deal partially financed by Koch Equity Development, a subsidiary of Koch Industries Incorporated.
And that's when Scarface says, now as I open up my story with the blaze of your blunts, and you can picture thoughts slowly up on phrases I wrote, and I can walk you through the days that I done, I often wish that I could save everyone, but I'm a dreamer. Have you ever seen a... let's end it right there.
I sit alone in my four-corner room staring at candles manufactured by Koch Industries. Bum, ba-dum, bum, 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 bum.
Instead of division, this event was a powerful example of bringing people together.
So basically, and this is, we're jumping ahead here, but I should give context to that article Andy wrote. According to, Jesus Christ. This article that Andy just read into the microphone, according to Jane Mayer's book, basically after the Koch networks lost in 2012, they underwent an attempt to reshape their image, and part of what they did was try to do the criminal justice reform thing, where they got on board with that.
Well, it wasn't just an image thing, and we'll get into that later.
Right. But just a fun little note, and again, jumping ahead, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is because John Oliver did a segment on them. They've been called sort of a conservative bill mill, where they write thousands of bills for Republican-controlled state legislatures around the country. They are primarily a advocate for the private prison industry. And so ALEC, as it's called, was a big supporter of mandatory minimums for drug convictions and these kinds of things in the 90s. All the while, Koch Industries has had a representative sitting on the board of ALEC. Charles Koch has given them a $500,000 loan in 97, donated a lot of money. So just the point is, like,
they're such philanthropists.
Yes. The point is, like, while they, like, came around to advocate for, like, criminal reform, which is mainly meant to, like, shield white-collar criminals like themselves, they are also, like, big funders of the mass incarceration in the United States and total hypocrites. And Jane Mayer also gives the example, like, in part of their imagery branding, they, like, opened up one of their seminars by quoting Martin Luther King Jr., which is always hilarious because they just kind of ignore his support for, nationalized health care and a job guarantee and all that. But anyways, we're jumping ahead. I would like to start.
I have a dream that every market will be free from interference. Black and white children can play together on an unregulated playground with sharp metal edges.
I have a dream that no corporation will be held accountable when its employees die of leukemia. But
I have a dream of a Dixie cup on every corner from here to Virginia.
but so anyway, so I want to start kind of at the beginning, which is
It's like 2 miles from the Lincoln Memorial.
It's not that far, but it would be good for their
Be a
bottom
lot of
line.
Dixie cups.
Be a lot of, yeah.
So to kind of go back in time a bit, so Steve actually was finding that the Kochs have been rich for like 6 generations.
Yeah, at least since the time of Fred Koch's grandfather. So
Right.
that would be 6 right there.
Okay, so yeah, you were saying he was like a rich shipbuilder in Europe, or at least a somewhat rich shipbuilder.
Before they immigrated from
Right.
the Netherlands.
Yeah, so they immigrated from the Netherlands, and I believe it was, Charles Koch's great-grandfather that immigrated, and he was a newspaper man.
Extra, extra, read all about it.
Or he ran a newspaper, that is. I believe in Kansas, but it was Charles Koch's father, Fred Koch, who really became fabulously wealthy.
That explains why every news article that comes out of Kansas about the Koch brothers is just one long filleting.
Oh, yeah.
Like bootlicker's paradise.
Yeah, it turns out when the 4th and 5th richest people in the world are, and the 2nd largest private corporation in the world is incorporated in your state, it sometimes distorts politics a little bit within the state.
These guys are so old money that they're actually like semi-partners of Family and Friends LLC. Like Fred is like a joint founder.
Yeah.
Your mama is so old money.
How old money is she?
I don't know. I couldn't finish that one.
Anyways, I want to say that Koch brothers are missing a great opportunity. There's this this picture from 2009 of a German woman who decided to jump into a polar bear enclosure in the Berlin Zoo, and they ruthlessly mauled her. She survived, but the image is
it's
on
harrowing.
this Telegraph article is pretty. Yeah, it's scary, and if they want to fight back against these polar bear loving hippies,
Yeah.
video of the polar bear owning a German lady.
I mean, to be fair, it's a zoo polar bear, right?
Yeah, they attack people in the wild in the 90s. They got 2.
In the 90s.
Yeah, I went to the bear mauling Wikipedia page and I couldn't find anything recent.
I mean,
Andy Palmer on the research as always.
It's mostly brown bears, which...
Okay, Andy, what the fuck is this all about, huh? The white polar bears never attack anything, but the brown bears are always attacking people? What are you, a Koch brother?
Because of the Kochs, when you looked for the polar bears, the extent of their range, it just says the 90s.
What if that's like Andy's like auditioning for like a job as like a Koch PR person where he's like, yeah, we're getting rid of the polar bears. Have you seen what they did to this woman?
It's woke. Like clap emoji, kill, clap emoji, all clap emoji, white, clap emoji bears.
I just love it. It's like, well, we have a lot of brown and black bear attacking people, but not a lot of polar. But with CGI, we can paint these black and brown bears white. I think
let's get $1 million grant from the Kochs to try and like stratify bear attacks by race and make it look like bears are primarily killing women and POCs, and just be like, it is the duty of us to destroy these bears. Otherwise, yeah, only straight white male bros want to keep bears alive. This is an issue to no one but the bros. Your mama is so old money, when she spreads her legs, Confederate dollars fall out. How about that?
it's a little wordy, but I like it.
Thanks. Anyways.
I have a dream that white and black polar bears can attack people equally. No segregation by attack.
All right, so Fred Koch, Charles and David Koch's father, is really the guy who makes the money for the family. He studies chemical engineering, and he comes up with a new method of oil refining. This is, I believe, back in the 1920s. In school, he comes up with a new method, and he tries to like ship it to the major, tries to sell it to the major oil companies, but they're like very dismissive of him at the time, so he kind of gets embittered. And eventually what he does in 1930, he goes to the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, and he helps them set up their first oil refineries. So he makes multiple trips to the Soviet Union from 1930 onward and helps them set up their various oil refineries, which later become, the heart of the rapidly industrializing Soviet Union.
Right.
Which, again, ironic because he becomes an ardent anti-communist later in life. But
and this was back in the USSR.
Yes.
Well, really what he was mad about was that Stalin betrayed the revolution.
Yes. He was a Trotskyite, and he never forgave Stalin for putting a pickaxe through his head.
Trotskyite. That's something an ultra-leftist would call a Trotskyist.
But so the fun thing with Charles Koch, Fred Koch, the grandfather, would later tell friends that his greatest regret in life was helping the Soviet Union build up their industrial capacity, which is funny because he also helped Nazi Germany do it. So basically, he eventually either gets kicked out. I believe he gets kicked out.
Whoa! But is he saying his biggest regret is helping the Soviets because they eventually helped beat the Nazis, and he's like, I could have made more money had the Nazis won. Like,
I could have made more.
Like, is that the intent?
He who makes $1 saves the whole world entire. I've been too lazy to cut up the Schindler's List drops for Andy, but I promise you they're coming, people.
I like how that's our tease on this podcast. Listen, Schindler List drops, guys, are coming. They're coming in hot.
I am an essential worker. All right. Well, so he eventually, this is how he first really makes his money, is helping the Soviet Union under Stalin set up these oil refineries. But by 1935, he's persona non grata with the Soviet Union. There have been various purges and these kinds of things. So he moves from the Soviet Union to, in 1935, he goes into a joint venture with Nazi Germany. Fred Koch does. He helps Nazi Germany set up an oil refinery in Hamburg in 1935. And Jane Mayer describes this very well in her book. Basically, it was in a joint venture with an American Nazi sympathizer named William Rhodes Davis. And William Rhodes Davis basically, he was an ardent Nazi who lobbied various Nazi officials to let him set up this oil refinery. And apparently he met with one of them and opened with a Heil Hitler salute to try and impress the guy for how much he was a radical Nazi. And eventually this American William Rhodes Davis actually has a personal meeting with Hitler because he's been trying to convince Hitler's advisors to go along with this oil refinery. Mm-hmm. And so finally he gets a face-to-face with Hitler and pitches him, and Hitler's like, hell yeah, let's do this. So Hitler approves it, and then it cuts through all the layers of bureaucracy. And then William Rhodes Davis goes...
Say what you will, but they got things done.
William Rhodes Davis goes to his partner, Fred Koch, and they set up the Hamburg oil refinery, which was a... Again, so basically, as we mentioned, Fred Koch came up with this new method of refining oil. So they take raw crude and they run it through this oil refinery, and then they have functional gasoline, functional oil. And this, of course, this oil refinery in Hamburg was a big part of the Nazi war machine and, provided the fuel that German tanks used when they were running through France in 1940. But just kind of fun things about this. The Hamburg oil refinery that Fred Koch set up was destroyed by American bombers in 1944. The Allies had been bombing it relentlessly since 1940, and more than 42,000 German civilians were killed in Hamburg over the course of bombing this oil refinery. And,
there was also the firestorm that incinerated people and melted them into asphalt.
This wasn't really a fun fact at all.
Well, the fun fact is that Charles Koch publishes a book called Secrets to Success.
What if he took credit for making the asphalt that people in Hamburg got melted into during the firebombing?
Oh, excuse me. Charles Koch published a book called The Science of Success.
Oh, thank God.
In which he
The skull science of success.
The racial science of success. The eugenics of success.
What's white is what's right.
Charles Koch publishes a book called The Science of Success, where he briefly mentions that his father worked for the Soviet Union, but for some reason does not mention that his father worked for Nazi Germany and visited the country multiple times. Though the cover of his book is the "Work Will Set You Free" sign at Auschwitz. Deep cut. But yes, so...
Not really a deep cut. That's pretty known, I think.
That gives a lot of context to the interview he did with Mike Rowe about the importance of hard work.
Yeah.
Not all jobs are dirty. Some of them you feel clean on the inside, even though the world becomes dirtier.
But so Fred Koch, by 35, he's traveling, I think like at least a couple times annually. I don't know the exact number of trips, but he makes a lot of trips to Nazi Germany in order to oversee this refinery. Though as the war breaks out, of course, he steps away. But interesting fact from the Jane Mayer book is that the nurse that Fred Koch hires to raise Frederick Koch is the oldest child, and Charles Koch is the second oldest. The nurse that he hires to raise them is a literal Nazi.
Oh, really?
In the sense that first she puts them on a very strict disciplinary regime where, like, Frederick Koch, the son, and Charles Koch would both have to, like, defecate every morning, and she would, like, watch them and make them defecate and then hit them if they didn't defecate. And Jane Mayer gets a little Freudian and kind of speculates to set up Charles Koch's later, absolute hate for all forms of, like, government authority and regulators, and his desire to be in complete control of everything.
Yeah, that makes sense. If someone told me to shit as a kid and they got mad if I didn't, I probably would hate everyone too.
Is this where the making people watch porn thing came in?
We'll get to that later. But so this nurse was, when I say she was a literal Nazi, she was a German lady who would speak German to them, and she left the family in 1940 because she was so euphoric that Hitler had invaded France that she had to fly back to Germany and be with the Nazi regime. So Charles Koch was raised by two literal Nazis.
I like how that there's a 2-week conversation. It's like, hey, listen, I like working for you guys. Your family's great. I mean, I gotta roll back. It's just,
have you seen the newsreel? I need to be there for that shit.
Listen, I mean, America's fun and all, but not enough swastikas. I just really want to be around my people,
Look, they gave me this new job at Dachau concentration camp.
I need more Lebensraum. I need more Lebensraum.
You know what? I understand. I hate the commies too. They bilked me out of the contract.
Listen,
I think he actually did accuse the Soviet Union of, like, screwing him over on financial stuff. But again, they made him a multimillionaire. The Soviet Union under Stalin did.
So once the American army got into the war, he stopped going back. But do you think that his ties to Nazi Germany, as well as other businessmen, is part of the reason why America didn't go into the war as quickly as they did? Could that be a possible connection? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, I mean, like, this is kind of a separate issue. I would argue U.S. public opinion was wildly against intervening in the war because of the experience of the First World War. So Franklin Roosevelt himself was kind of in favor of intervention, but had to kind of, like, gently steer the American public into it. And then, like, in 1940, he ran for re-election saying we wouldn't get involved in the war. And then, of course, we did after Pearl Harbor. And so, like, certainly the American business community had big ties to Hitler. We'll talk about IBM on their role in computer technology for cataloging things.
More like 5 a.m. Yeah, now we're not going to get hired to replace Nick Mullen.
What are you going to do?
For those who don't listen, to Cumtown, Nick Mullen, the host of Cumtown, a very funny comedian, he tweeted about IBM's role in the Holocaust and then later got a commercial with IBM. And then the Cumtown fans made IBM aware of his previous tweets and cost him more than $50,000.
Wow.
But so
Let's
anyways.
have him on for the IBM episode.
I'm sure he'll be thrilled to talk about it. Yeah, you know that time you could have made like almost 6 figures for an hour's worth of work, but a bunch of assholes on the internet thought it would be funny to ruin that for you?
I mean, it would have been 5 figures just with taxes in general, so let's not talk about it.
Hey, maybe
And that's what the Koch brothers are standing up
That's
against.
right. That's right.
But anyways, it was a separate conversation. But yes, American industrialists were a big part of Hitler's rise to power and his rearmament. You know, as we said, the Nazi Germany was entirely committed to government spending for the purposes of rearmament, and this oil refinery that, again, made Fred Koch fabulously rich was part of the Nazi German rearmament and absolutely provided fuel for the German tanks, German planes, everything. So yeah, and if you thought Fred Koch maybe moderated his views in later years, I have a pleasant surprise for you. Fred Koch, of course, was one of the 11 original members of the John Birch Society, which was founded in 1958. The John Birch Society is, interestingly enough, set up by a guy named Robert Welsh Jr., who was a founding member of the company that made Thin Mints. Basically, they had a candy company, and then he used his fortune to pursue radical right-wing causes. And so the John Birch Society, for those not familiar with it, they're named after, I believe, a CIA agent named John Birch who was killed in the Korean War. And they say this was the first American killed by communism.
What?
Yeah. So they're a radical anti-communist organization. And just to give you some perspective on how radical they are, they can do 360s on the skateboard. And,
Radical dude.
they also believed that President Eisenhower was a communist.
Oh, really?
Like, they believed the Republican president who kept the New Deal in place and, you know, overthrew the democratically elected president of Iran was like a communist sympathizer because he wasn't hard right enough for them. And so Fred Koch becomes one of the original 11 members of the John Birch Society. He's a big funder of it, and he self-publishes a pamphlet in 1960 called A Businessman Looks at Communism. And Fred Koch, again, Charles and David Koch's father, believed that in this pamphlet he says that communists are mobilizing blacks to take over America. And, of course, this is, you know, shortly after Brown v. Board of Education, which took place in Kansas where they lived, or the original case came from a Kansas school district. So desegregation was a big issue at the time in the 50s. And many members of the John Birch Society, including Fred Koch, believed that desegregation was a communist plot. And if I can just quote from what Fred Koch wrote in this pamphlet, A Businessman Looks at Communism, he says, quote, "The colored man looms large in the communist plot to take over America." And he also says that welfare is a secret plot to lure blacks to cities where they will launch a, quote, vicious race war. Oh. So, you know, a man who his biggest regret in life is funding the Soviet Union. And
vicious race war in the cities, eh? That's the fucking gambit here. That's what they're saying.
Mm-hmm.
Man,
yeah. It turns out when you don't let people starve to death, it's a plot to formulate a vicious race war.
I'm reading an article of theirs on New World Order approaching fast.
Oh, is this a modern John Birch Society?
Yeah, this is on their website, and one of the here's a sentence from it: "Democracy, remember, has been described as 2 wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner."
Yeah, the John Birch Society is still around today. And so actually Charles Koch, who we'll get to shortly, but Charles Koch learned a lot from the John Birch Society when he set up his network. His father brought him to these John Birch Society meetings and, you know, tried to like impart the influence on him. And so Charles Koch, again, according to Jane Mayer's book, basically what he learned from the John Birch Society was, first, secrecy was paramount because the John Birch Society, again, as a radical anti-communist group that thought the U.S. government was infiltrated by communists and these sorts of things, and segregation was a communist plot, etc. They knew that it was important to protect their members' identities and, not allow public disclosure of who funds them, who's involved. And so Charles Koch learned from that when he set up his network. But the other big thing he learned was the John Birch Society was, I don't know the current membership structure, but it was a non-profit with private stockholders and a board of directors, which is the way that Robert Welch Jr., the candy fanatic, was able to essentially entirely control the John Birch Society, where you can set up these private quote-unquote non-profits that you still exercise absolute control over, and Charles would actually emulate that structure exactly when he set up the libertarian think tank, the Cato Institute, in 1974. So basically, he learned those kinds of lessons from the John Birch Society, though he himself, again, according to Jane Mayer, was kind of turned off by some of the conspiratorial thinking.
Yeah, well, one of the first campaigns of the John Birch Society was to get the U.S. out of the United Nations. The global power elites view the UN as their main vehicle for establishing step-by-step a socialistic global government controlled by themselves. Mm-hmm. Now more than ever, we need to get out of the UN and remove the UN from the United States.
We would like to preemptively thank the John Birch Society for their help in our research for the Rothschilds episode. But yeah, so the John Birch Society, conspiratorial, but a big influence on Charles Koch's thinking. And Charles Koch was he becomes essentially the alpha of the four brothers.
Nice.
Yeah, I mean, like, as Jane Mayer describes it, when they're growing up, Charles is kind of like the one in charge. Though Frederick, so just to kind of go through the four brothers, because as we mentioned, there are four brothers. So Frederick Koch is the oldest, Charles Koch is the second oldest, and then David and Bill Koch are twins, and they're the youngest.
I found probably the best way to describe them. Charles is Groucho. He's considered the funny one, always with the wisecracks. David's Chico, the sleazy urbanite and the lovable con man.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Frederick is Zeppo. He left the family business and no one really cares about him. And Bill is Harpo, who, because he mostly communicates using horns and whistles.
So which one stood up to the Nazi governess the most?
Would it be Charles? Groucho?
He was kind of the alpha.
Groucho Koch?
We all remember that wacky Marx Brothers movie where they're like helping put fuel in the Panzer tanks and it keeps coming out of the other side and like spouting out of the top. It's lots of slapstick.
Yeah, the movie's called Jew Soup.
But so
Ukrainian crackers.
That's a great band name, by the way. You need a band name. Ukrainian Crackers. I'm looking for that.
A night at Treblinka.
Anyway, if you want to, here's Charles explaining their political philosophy.
Charles Koch.
I don't know what they have to say. It makes no difference anyway. Whatever it is, I'm against it. No matter what it is or who commenced it, I'm against it.
That's libertarianism.
That's from Duck Soup, right?
I believe, or horse feathers.
Okay. Anyways, R.I.P. Groucho. Anyways, so the John Birch Society.
And here's David Koch.
Mm-hmm. Whatever it is, I don't like it.
The John Birch Society is very influential on Charles Koch. And so, as we mentioned, Charles Koch is the second oldest, but he becomes the alpha, essentially. Jane Mayer describes him as like bullying the other brothers and really influencing their thinking and these kinds of things.
Bullying being telling them when to poop in the morning and then hitting them if they don't.
Well, he learned it from elsewhere.
Yeah, not quite that. But so basically what happens is Charles Koch goes to MIT. He gets a BS in General Engineering in 1957, an MS in Nuclear Engineering in 1958, a second MS in Chemical Engineering 1960, and I'm sure it did not hurt that his father was on the Board of Trustees at MIT. So, merit-based.
Then he got an MFA from the New School.
But so basically...
He's really good at analyzing the power of dance.
I want to talk a bit about Charles Koch's kind of political awakening, as it were. What happens is there's...
Whatever it is, I'm against it.
There's a free market organization set up in 1957 called the Freedom School. And this is
what a great name, the Freedom School.
Right.
How could you be against that?
It's the Freedom School.
And again, I owe this research to Jane Mayer, but she says the founder of this was a guy who in the 1940s set up a self-actualization movement called the Mighty I Am that was basically like a cult, and it whipped audiences into a frenzy by having them chant "annihilate them" in response to the names Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt.
What?
So basically the speaker would get up and be like, Franklin Roosevelt, and then they would all be like, annihilate them. And, so this gives you kind of an idea of their views on the New Deal and these kinds of things. But the founder of this sets up an organization called the Freedom School in 1957. And I believe in the early 1960s, Charles Koch attends this, and he convinces his other three brothers into also attending it. David Koch kind of like follows Charles's lead, and then Bill Koch does as well, but Frederick Koch doesn't really get into it. He thinks the Freedom School is kind of a cult. And if you were wondering why, there were two faculty members at the Freedom School, one of whom was a Holocaust denier. A group of teachers in 1959 visited the Freedom School and described it as proposing reducing the Bill of Rights to one right, quote, the right to own property. Again, credit to Jane Mayer for this. She also said that the Freedom School preached that the Civil War should not have been fought. The South should have been allowed to secede because human beings should be allowed to sell themselves into slavery if they want to.
That sounds like a choice.
Wow.
So basically, and the Freedom School also at this point in time had no black students, and the founder said it's because, quote, some of our students and teachers are segregationists.
Oh, my God.
And this is Charles Koch, as late as, I believe, 1999, said that this organization was profoundly influential on his thinking, though he and David later distanced themselves from the founder for obvious reasons.
I wonder why that happened.
But because in the Freedom School in the 60s, that is when Charles Koch first read Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises, the conservative economists that are basically like, the free market should decide everything, all government control is like slavery and these kinds of things.
That's Nobel Prize winner Friedrich Hayek, right?
Though Hayek did actually say, though it's like not mentioned as much, he actually did believe the poor should have a minimum standard of living. But again, this part always gets glossed over, much like kind of the way conservatives talk about Adam Smith, where they ignore all the inconvenient points that he made and focus entirely on free markets decide everything correctly.
Oh, the invisible hand that he talked a lot about in one sentence.
Basically, Charles Koch becomes a big funder of the Freedom School. And what really launches Charles Koch's so-called philanthropic career is that after he graduates, his father wants him to come back and take over Koch Industries. Fred Koch does. So he does come back to Kansas, Charles Koch does, and he sends himself into a period of deep study. Like, I think he reads tons of books in the 60s, and again attends the Freedom School, and this is where he finds these conservative economists. And
he read, quote, like a demon.
Okay.
According to David Koch.
Well, that's no nice way to talk about von Mises.
Like a Demon, the extended title, touched for the very first time.
All right, so he reads Like a Demon, and he goes into
it's not a book, it's how much he read.
He goes into a deep period of study, and in 1967, their father, the avowed Nazi and John Birch Society member, whose greatest regret was funding the Soviet Union, R.I.P., he dies in 1967.
But before that, Charles proposed to apparently buy two trucking companies. And his father, before he went on a safari in Africa, apparently, was preoccupied with how much money he needed to save to pay his federal death taxes.
Right.
So he told Charles to buy only one, but Charles bought both. And Fred was furious. He met him at the airport, and he would barely talk to him. The only thing he'd say was, quote, "Son, I've been trying to save enough money to pay my death taxes, and you're going out and just wasting it." It's a great father-son dynamic right there.
This is the worst
My
thing.
heart just break.
Fred Koch said, "This is the worst thing since the German army stopped at Moscow." My fuel wasn't enough to get them there. Goddamn Russian winter. But so interesting topic on the death taxes. So basically, and again, credit to Jane Mayer. She did the research for this episode, at least my research. She quotes the Koch family as setting up what is called a charitable trust foundation, and this is a way of shielding Fred Koch's inheritance from the death tax. So basically, in 1967, when when Fred Koch dies, Koch Industries is making about $177 million annual revenue, and that's in 1967 dollars. David Koch later said that his father gave him a $300 million inheritance. So again, he split his inheritance equally among his 4 sons. They would later fight for it and have legal battles, which we'll get into later. But the point here is they set up this charitable trust, and because of the way tax...
I think Charles and David had this discussion about the contract.
Well, I don't know. It's all right. That's in every contract. That's what they call a sanity clause. You can't fool me. There ain't no sanity clause.
R.I.P. Okay, so they set up what was called a charitable trust for the Koch Foundation. Now, basically, the way tax law was structured is that they can pass on the entire inheritance, shield it from taxation, as long as the trust donates the interest that it occurs to nonprofit organizations for 20 years. And this is what really sets off Charles and later David Koch on their quote-unquote philanthropy, because they have this charitable trust where they have to donate all of the interest from it to charitable organizations in order to shield their inheritance from taxation. So Charles Koch becomes a funder of the previously mentioned Freedom School, and he is able to count this as charitable giving because this radical segregationist organization is an educational school. So, and then he later repeats the model with the Cato Institute, founded in 1974. But the point is, because they were able to shield their father's money from taxation through a charitable trust, they later realized they could weaponize philanthropy into basically creating the entire libertarian movement.
And this was around the time that Charles got engaged to Liz, right?
Yes, I believe so.
I think there was something...
Will you marry me? Did he leave you any money? Answer the second question first.
All right. Well, so anyways, Charles Koch, he's a big funder of the Freedom School, and at this point he's kind of into the radical libertarian philosophy, but this really picks up in the 1970s with the founding of the EPA under President Nixon, and Koch Industries starts getting involved in some legal and regulatory battles. And
what? The EPA has a problem with the Koch Industries?
Yeah, believe it or not, it is a major producer of, I think, the #1 producer of toxic waste in the country. I mentioned that up top.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, did you know that the EPA is full of unelected bureaucrats who are enforcing their will on these innocent individuals, all these people, like Koch Industries?
What?
Actually, we should... before I jump ahead here, I do want to talk a bit about Frederick Koch, because there is a story in the book that I read as research.
Guys, Sean read a book.
460 pages.
He had notes.
There's a story in there. So basically, the oldest brother, Freddie or Frederick Koch,
Zeppo,
he's rumored to be gay, though he personally denies it. As you can imagine...
So he's very sad?
Their father, yes, he's like, no, I'm horribly depressed. I am not gay. So
you took the bait.
The story in Jane Mayer's book is essentially this: before their father dies, Charles Koch comes up with a plot to try and steal Frederick's share of the company. What he does is, I believe Charles and one of his friends visit Frederick's apartment, I think in the West Village at the time. This is in the 1960s. and find compromising evidence that supposedly shows that he is gay. And then they invite him into a board meeting of their division of Koch Industries without telling him what's up. And then once they're gathered there, Charles leads the other two brothers in confronting Frederick about his homosexuality and saying that he will tell their father if he doesn't sell his shares in the company to them.
What?
And Frederick storms out of the meeting, and he later says, Frederick later tells a biographer that this blackmail attempt didn't work because he is not gay. But interestingly enough, while all of his brothers got engineering degrees, Freddie attended Harvard and studied playwriting at the Yale School of Drama.
Oh, well.
So not to stereotype, but who knows?
But also, in their unguarded moments, the other Koch brothers will admit that Frederick was the funniest.
Frederick was a big fixture at the Algonquin Round Table in the 1920s. But yes, so, and we should mention, Frederick is the only brother, I believe, who is not a billionaire. He is still a multimillionaire. But what happens...
Aww.
What happens is in 1983, after protracted fights about this and that direction of the company, David Koch follows Charles's lead, the alpha brother, and they go off in one direction. And what happens is Frederick and Bill Koch sell their stock in the company. Again, their father divided it equally between the four of them. They sell their stock to David and Charles Koch in 1983 for about $800 million. Bill Koch and Frederick Koch would later sue the other brothers, saying that they had undervalued the company and, hid material information from them and these kinds of things because, again, the other two Koch brothers are now worth $60 billion each because it is a hugely profitable company, partly because...
that conversation went something like this.
You want I should steal?
Oh, no. It's not stealing.
Well, then I couldn't do it.
But Frederick's gay. I mean, he would have spent money on all this gay stuff. I mean, who wants to hang out with a dude that's gay?
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Who wants to hang out with a dude who buys art not to launder money with it? But so anyways, the point is, Bill Koch later goes on to become the founder and president of Oxbow Energy Group, which is another kind of... energy company, which is...
energy drink?
Yeah. It's not as big as Koch Industries, but Bill Koch, Forbes does put him at $1.8 billion net worth as of 2018. So Bill Koch is a billionaire, but not nearly to the extent of the other Kochs, whereas Frederick Koch merely settles to being worth hundreds of millions of dollars.
It goes to say, if you suck dick, you're going to be paid less eventually.
Mm-hmm. Fun story about Bill Koch. He would spend $65 million to win the America's Cup in yachting in 1992 because, skill sport.
Yeah.
Well, and he won by pulling a fish out of his pants and throwing it at his competitor.
It is funny to me, as a avid Magic the Gathering player, people sometimes complain that it's a pay-to-win game, but it's it's not quite yachting. Where you can just spend $65 million to win the highest honor in yachting.
If you spent $65 million on Magic, could you be the best Magic player in the world?
Yeah, probably. I could certainly be the most annoying. I could have the best Instagram presence. It would just be me shredding Black Lotuses.
I would love if there was a Koch presence in Magic the Gathering tournament. One of the brothers was an avid.
Apparently, Martin Shkreli was in part of his publicity stunt, threatening to buy up Black Lotuses and other super rare Magic cards just to piss off the community, and that's really what got him 12 years in prison.
You can't fuck with Magic players.
We have... I don't want to talk out of school, but a lot of federal judges come to the tournaments.
Really?
No, not to the best of my knowledge.
All right, so I found a quote from Bill Koch after the yacht race.
Okay, yeah, play it.
So I guess really what's happening here is after Charles Koch is influenced by the Freedom School and the John Birch Society, and again he gets his brothers to attend, David Koch in particular really becomes an acolyte of this philosophy as well. But he is, by the 70s, a dyed-in-the-wool libertarian, radical libertarian. In every sense of the word, he believes the only thing the government should do is protect property rights. And so what happens is...
Whatever it is, I don't like it.
What happens in the 70s and then 80s, the Koch brothers essentially create the modern libertarian movement in the sense that David Koch in 1980 runs for vice president on the libertarian ticket. And they do that in order to skirt campaign finance laws, where David Koch can just spend infinite amount of money on the Libertarian Party because he's an actual candidate instead of an outside donor at this point. But so what we really kind of want...
And they won by a landslide, right?
Yes. The smartest investment money can buy. But so in 1974, Charles Koch sets up the Cato Institute with Murray Rothbard, the conservative economist, who I believe believes there should be a functioning market for children in a perfect libertarian society. I might be confusing him with a different radical economist, but I promise you he believes shit like that. So in 1974, Charles Koch, Ed Crane, who we'll talk about next week, and Murray Rothbard set up the Cato Institute. The Cato Institute is a nonprofit with private stockholders controlled entirely by Charles Koch and a board of directors controlled by Charles Koch. And Ed Crane is the first president of the Libertarian Cato think tank, but according to one insider that Jane Mayer quotes, he would always call Wichita, Kansas, and run things by Charles first. So Charles Koch funds this think tank and essentially uses it as an ideological production line where Jane Mayer talks about this, where Charles Koch follows the Friedrich Hayek model of production, where essentially they use their money to produce think tanks that create ideas and then scholars that go out and advocate for those ideas, and then eventually politicians and media people to implement those ideas.
You know, those are a lot of words for just propaganda.
Yes.
Like, that's a lot of words for, we're going to make some shit up and people are going to talk about it. Like, that's crazy.
Right.
Well, Yogi, do you have a Nobel Prize?
I guess not.
I actually have an audio clip from Charles. It's something he said to David while he was giving a speech while he was running for vice president.
Talk fast. I see a man in the crowd with a rope.
All right, so here's the quote from Murray Rothbard. He says in The Ethics of Liberty that a parent should not have legal obligation to feed, clothe, or educate his children, since such obligations would entail positive acts coerced upon the parents and depriving the parent of his rights.
Oh, my God.
So essentially, he believed in abortion at 16 years old. The parent therefore may murder or mutilate his child, and the law properly outlaws a parent from doing so, but the parent should have the legal right to... the parent may not murder or mutilate his child, but the parent should have the legal right to not feed the child, i.e. allow it to die. Yes. He continues, Murray Rothbard continues, if a parent may own his child... then he may also transfer the ownership to someone else.
What?
He may give the child out for adoption, or he may sell the rights to the child in a voluntary contract. In short, we must face the fact that a purely free society will have a flourishing free market in children. He does acknowledge, superficially, this sounds monstrous and inhumane, but closer thought...
Superficially.
But closer,
in a certain light.
But closer thought will reveal the superior humanism of such a market. That is why Estonia has adopted Murray Rothbard as its national mascot, because of their underground child sex slavery market that is actually the most humane and free thing possible.
It's the freest market.
But yes, economist Murray Rothbard, who you just heard from, was a co-founder of the Cato Institute, along with Ed Crane and Charles Koch. And Murray Rothbard was later forced out by Charles Koch. As we mentioned, Charles controls everything about the Cato Institute, and he later had disparaging things to say about Charles Koch, essentially that he ran Cato Institute like a dictatorship. So yeah, and I guess we'll kind of leave it...
It was not a free market of ideas?
Turns out it wasn't.
No, it is a free market because the idea with the most money rises to the top.
Oh, yeah.
But we're kind of leaving it here. So next week, if you'll turn back in, we'll give you a bit of a preview of what we're going to be talking about. They run
next week on Grubstakers.
Next week on Grubstakers, the Koch brothers run for president on the Libertarian ticket in 1980. David Koch runs for vice president. They fund the Libertarian Party, and they pour money into libertarian causes. But after the Clinton administration investigates them, they become heavy funders of the Republican Party, and that later is kicked into high gear by Citizens United, where they become a third political party unto themselves. So we'll talk all about their interactions with Obama, their influence on George W. Bush, and, the people that they've killed, including employees and residents of small towns where they have dumped horrific benzene pollution. So all that and more coming up next week on part 2 of the Koch brothers.
And with that, I'm Yogi Polywall.
I'm Andy Palmer.
I'm Sean McCarthy.
Steve Jeffers.
Toodles.
Bye. Thanks for listening. Hey, everybody. Welcome to Grubstakers. In this part 2 of our special episode about the Koch brothers, we explore how they transitioned from being merely libertarian crank billionaires to controlling the entire Republican Party, and how one EPA investigation really set them off on that path. Then we take a look at how Citizens United allowed them to spend almost as much as the Democratic and Republican parties in the 2016 election. In many ways, the Koch brothers are their own third political party. And also, Charles Koch's son killed a 12-year-old. All that and more coming up on Grubstakers.
I think we disproportionately stop whites too much.
I taught those kids lessons on product development and marketing, and they taught me what it was like growing up feeling targeted for your race.
I am proud to be gay. I am proud to be a Republican.
You know, I went to a tough school in Queens, and they used to beat up the little Jewish boys.
You know, I love having the support of real billionaires.
All right, we all ready?
Yep.
Hey, listeners. Welcome back to Grubstakers. This is part 2 of our Koch brothers episode. Sean McCarthy, take it away.
Oh, yeah. Hey, welcome back, everybody. Koch brothers, part 2 of 2. Sean P. McCarthy here, as always.
Andy Palmer.
Steve Jeffers.
Yogi Polywall.
And we left you last week with the story of one Fred Koch, a hardworking industrialist who...
blood and soil industrialist.
An industrialist who covered a lot of ground, as it were, who provided the fuel for the fire.
A lot of living ground.
That's right.
He was really instrumental in the tailorization techniques of a large-scale industrial operation that was extremely profitable, that harvested gold and clothing and hair, made
like,
candles.
Like a Goodwill. I think that's like a thrift store with a bad attitude, but a good heart.
Fred Koch, Charles and David Koch's father, helped set up an oil refinery in Hamburg, Germany, under the Nazi regime in 1935. It's part of what made him a multimillionaire at the time, his Koch Industries. Not only that, they set up oil refineries for the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin. He later became an ardent anti-communist, but he died in 1967. And he split his company between his 4 brothers. Charles Koch, David Koch, Frederick Koch, Bill Koch. Now, what happened...
And to review, Charles is Groucho. He's the funny one. David is Chico. He lives in Manhattan. He's the sleazy urbanite.
Mm-hmm.
Frederick is Zeppo. He left the family business early on, and no one really knows much about him or cares. And Bill is Harpo, who mostly communicates through horns and whistles.
And for our more millennial listeners, just think of the Arrested Development family. that's a good chunk of what we're talking about here.
There's like they had to...
Yeah, this bit would have gone over when hipster authenticity was more in vogue, like 8 years ago.
Yeah.
I guess, Arrested Development did kind of update the reference so that the father helps Saddam Hussein instead of Adolf Hitler.
I mean, it works. When it works, it works.
Yeah. But
no touching.
But so anyways, so the father splits his inheritance equally between his 4 children. However, fights break out, conflict, these sorts of things. And eventually, what happens is that Bill and Frederick Koch agree to sell their shares of the company to Charles and David Koch in 1983 for about $800 million. Later lawsuits are filed by the other brothers because they say that they were stripped of more money that they should have had because Charles and David hid the true value of the company and this, that, and the other. They later settled those lawsuits, but the family still is there's a lot of recrimination. Jane Mayer writes about how at their mother's funeral, apparently Bill didn't make eye contact with the other brothers, and Frederick, who loved his mother, wasn't even there because David or Charles Koch.
That's sad because Bill mostly communicates through facial expressions.
Charles Koch set up the funeral in some way to exclude Frederick from being able to make it, which is alpha.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Just but anyways, that's actually his secret of what is called market-based management is planning funerals planning your mother's funeral to make sure your brother you don't can't be there. But anyways, so
if you do the game theory, that's the optimal outcome. Is excluding your brother from the funeral.
But the point of this was that as we have mentioned on the previous episode, there are 4 Koch brothers, but the reason people only think of Charles and David is because Charles and David are the ones who control more than, together, 80% of Koch Industries. Again, the second largest private corporation in the world.
And their combined net worth is $120 billion, I believe.
Yes.
They each have $60 billion.
Yes, they are each holders of more than 40% of Koch Industries, which is primarily what generates their huge amount of wealth. But so Charles Koch, in particular, as the alpha of the brothers, sets off to impose...
Again, Groucho.
impose his libertarian vision on the country. Because, in the 60s and 70s, these ideas are extremely fringe. His idea that, as he learned at the Freedom School, that we should abolish everything in the Bill of Rights except for the right to own property.
Whatever it is, I'm against it.
And so in 1974, Charles Koch, Ed Crane, and Murray Rothbard, famous for his market in children, set up the Cato Institute. The Cato Institute is a libertarian think tank that is entirely controlled by Charles Koch.
Keyword there is tank.
Yes. And it will later have a storied history of publishing report and study after study denying the existence of global warming. But in the 1970s, it's kind of a dormant think tank, and they have this idea, Charles and David get the idea to take over the Libertarian Party. Again, a very small, very fringe organization in the United States of America. But the method that they do that is in 1980, David Koch runs for the vice presidency under the Libertarian Party ticket. And they think up this idea to circumvent, at the time, existing campaign finance laws. Jane Mayer quotes David Koch as giving a speech before the Libertarian Convention in 1980, saying that he promised to spend unlimited amounts of his fortune in service of the Libertarian Party to a wild...
Talk fast. I see a man in the crowd with a rope.
to wild cheers from the assembled libertarians as they realized that their market for children was soon to be at hand. But so basically, they run for the vice presidency in 1980, and Jane Mayer says that Charles kind of put David up to this because Charles Koch, who again lives in Kansas, whereas David Koch lives in New York City and runs the New York side of the business from New York, whereas Charles Koch is at the headquarters in Wichita, Kansas. Charles puts David up for running for president because Charles is doesn't like the spotlight, But they hatch this plan to take over the Libertarian Party. They spend tens of millions of dollars on this 1980 election, and they walk away with 1.1% of the vote.
Entirely from people in their late 20s and early 30s, guys in their late 20s and early 30s who latched on to their age of consent policy.
But so basically, this experience kind of humbles them on the political process, and they rethink their outlook. Because when we associate the Kochs with the Republican Party, we have to understand that is a relatively recent phenomenon in that it's only really happened in the last 2 decades, less than that. Charles Koch has said that Ronald Reagan was a sellout, the famously conservative president in the 1980s, who, of course, when Reagan took office...
Wait, who was Reagan?
When Reagan took office in 1980, the highest income tax rate in the United States was 70%. When he left office, it was under 30%. Wow. I think it was like 28%.
What a tax and spend liberal.
But that guy was a sellout. So they really didn't donate much to the Republican Party, but... that really changes with an investigation launched against them by the Clinton administration, because, as we mentioned on the previous institute,
the Socialist Vanguard.
As we mentioned on the previous episode, Koch Industries is one of the top 10 polluters in both air, water, and climate. They dump more than 26 million tons of carbon into the atmosphere every year. They are big proponents of global warming, which, unsurprisingly, the Cato Institute, libertarian think tank, promotes their bottom line interest by hiring scholars and pushing out studies to deny the existence of man-made global warming. And I think before we get into their investigation by the Clinton administration, I do just want to skip ahead to a couple fun facts about the Cato Institute. So basically, Ed Crane, who we mentioned co-founded the Cato Institute, he was the president of the Cato Institute. He gave this quote in the early 2000s saying, quote, "There are more polar bears today than there have ever been. Global warming theories just give the government..."
We have to change that.
Global warming theories just give the government more control of the economy. Jane Mayer says that after the scientists, the global warming scientists, had their emails hacked and they were leaked to the press, one Cato scholar gave more than 20 media interviews on the subject in the 2 weeks following. And they, again, published a stream of articles denying global warming. So it's very hard to separate their ideological vision from the fact that Charles Koch totally controls the board of directors of the Cato Institute and has a bottom line interest in distorting the science on global warming. And small follow-up on Mr. Ed Crane, president of the Cato Institute, former president. He was forced out in 2011 for being quoted in the media dismissing Charles Koch's idea of market-based management. And Charles Koch came up with this idea of market-based management, which was his idea that the best companies simulate the free market by having divisions compete against each other for rewards and resources, which is really dumb and bullshit. And part of the reason Sears is going out of business is because the CEO adopted this as well. But basically, Ed Crane, the president of Cato, was quoted in the media as being dismissive of this idea. And so Charles Koch, as complete controller of the Cato Institute, pushed him out, just like he pushed out Marie Market for Children Rothbard, by setting up other people on the board to force Ed Crane out in 2011. But in this year, 2018, Politico runs a fun article about Mr. Ed Crane, Mr. There Are More Polar Bears Than There Have Ever Been. And I'm just going to quote from Politico here. One former Cato employee during the late 1990s recalled visiting Crane's office on multiple occasions and finding him viewing pornography on his computer. On one occasion, Crane told the employee that she resembled a woman in one of the pictures.
Oh, my God.
And on another occasion told her he would like to see how her breast measured up to the images on his screen. She said Crane made dozens of sexual comments to her during her time at Cato.
I read it was actually Baker's dozens of comments.
I just feel so much sympathy for people who just want to like wake up, and the women, strong, powerful women who just want to wake up and put in a hard day's work, starving welfare recipients, and talking about how food stamps are like the greatest government giveaway while ignoring oil subsidies and Defense Department contracts, and they have to deal with these kinds of fucking creeps. You know, he really gives a bad name to the market for children. But one other quote from that Politico article, again quoting, 3 other former Cato employees described witnessing Ed Crane making sexual and other inappropriate comments to young women at Cato, both at work and during after-work events. Crane drank alcohol in his office during the day, according to multiple former employees. One male employee said he saw Crane try to unsnap the bra of a female colleague at an office party on a boat on the Potomac River.
Wow.
If he was such a bad boss, though. The market wouldn't have allowed him to hold that position.
Well, another quote from the Cato from the Politico story: Crane was paid $400,000 annually by the Cato Institute. So the free market, and you know what? The free market allocates resources efficiently, so it is not our place to complain.
It's a Pareto optimal situation.
Exactly.
One guy starts with everything. And no one can be made better off if he shifts any into them.
But yeah, no. So and it quotes, and so again, the Kochs, Charles Koch specifically, forced this guy out because he mocked his idiotic management theory. But they're like quoted in the Politico article as being like, we only found out about his sexual harassment after we forced him out, and we're very disappointed, and we had no idea this was going on. And again, this is a organization that was completely controlled by Charles Koch, so I 100% believe he was at least partially aware of these kinds of things because, again, in the Politico article, multiple employees said that they forwarded these complaints about Ed Crane up the chain. So it's like, not only are you just a barbarous human being who takes blood money to libel welfare recipients and demand draconian cuts to the Environmental Protection Agency that destroy lives and kill people through pollution caused by your main benefactor, but you also really need to understand that no means no, buddy.
Wow. How dare the Koch brothers be such Kochs?
Counterpoint.
If we have a two-tiered society with some successful and a bunch aren't, that isn't sustainable and it's not just.
Sounds pretty woke to me.
But yes, so the Cato Institute is essentially an ideological
That's
show.
why you should be able to trade children. So some of those children who aren't going to be successful get to look in at what the good life's like.
Yeah.
Right.
The single-tiered society where all children are slaves.
Single-tiered. The state should provision child slaves. Who said it, me or Plato?
Look, you shouldn't be allowed to murder your child, but it is coercion if the government forces you to feed your child. But yes, so the point is, the Cato Institute, as we have mentioned a couple times, it followed the model of the John Birch Society, where Charles Koch set it up in 1974 as a nonprofit with stockholders and a board of directors, with Charles Koch personally controlling the stock and the board of directors. So essentially, unsurprisingly, this libertarian think tank primarily promotes bottom-line issues for Charles Koch. And this really shouldn't shock anyone, because in a world with capital, where capital funds politicians, political movements, ideas, those ideas that are beneficial to the holders of capital will, for some reason, get more amplification than those ideas that are beneficial to people who do not hold capital, like, those welfare recipients that Cato Institute is always demonizing. So essentially, they set up this real think tank movement, and it comes into its own. But an important thing to understand is that what we understand as the modern libertarian movement is entirely astroturfed by the Koch brothers and a bunch of useful idiots who, unfortunately, I am including my high school self in on this. So they also set up the, I believe, the Reason Foundation, and the Reason Foundation publishes Reason Magazine every month. Reason Magazine is a libertarian magazine.
No, it's a silent T, actually.
Reason Magazine is a libertarian magazine, again, funded by the Koch brothers, and to my great...
Yeah, but it sounds reasonable. Let's hear them out.
To my great embarrassment, in my high school days, I paid for a subscription to the Libertarian Reason magazine. And I know on a previous episode, I mocked the gentleman who donated $20 to the GoFundMe for Jeff Bezos. But I would just like to say, as somebody who sent subscription money to Reason magazine, I am just as stupid. This magazine that is totally underwritten by the Koch brothers and exists only to promote their bottom line thinking. But anyways, so it's like the libertarian movement is a bottom line movement for the Kochs and other billionaires and multimillionaires to protect their own interests, and it portrays it in a cool, hey man, let's smoke weed and, ignore age of consent laws way. But,
yeah.
But it's a bottom line business movement that takes in a lot of gullible idiots and is extremely well funded.
That said, you can intern at the Reason Magazine offices this summer, and interns work for 12 weeks and receive a $7,200 stipend, which is $7,200 more than The Daily Show or the Colbert Report used to pay.
Yeah, it's interesting how when your entire job is to actively underwrite multi-billionaire polluters, how they are better able to pay you than a comedy show. But yeah, no. Shout out to all the libertarians out there. You guys definitely are in control of your own agency. And
listen, is 2018 really deadlier for school children than service members? The Washington Post headline is misleading.
Oh. Well, there are more polar bears now than there have ever been.
Those Coke commercials. I mean, you see them fucking polar bears? Drinking Cokes? My Cokes.
You see, their dad, Fred, would have taken a different tact and say the white bears succeeded beyond all measure. And this is just proof, of his family's racial purity.
Fred Koch was like, the brown bears are a communist plot to take over the jungle. All right, so...
Also new in Reason Magazine, it's time to put our federal meat inspection law out to pasture.
Oh, my God.
Outdated regulations are hampering the beef meat industry.
That's fun, because did you know that the only reason we have laws against E. coli in beef was because that kid in the 90s died eating an undercooked Jack-in-the-Box hamburger.
Worth it.
E. coli hamburger. But interestingly enough, the chicken industry has always fought against similar regulations for salmonella in chicken, instead blaming people when they die from salmonella for not cooking their meat properly.
Oh my God.
And this has been a constant fight with the, I believe the FDA regulates this, but this has been a constant fight where in the United States today you can get salmonella chicken because the government
You mean like you can order it? Like
Yes, you can be like, I want the extra salmonella. I'm having the in-laws over.
That said, they also say that Deadpool 2, pretty good.
Oh. So I want to talk a bit about, because we mentioned here, the run for the vice presidency ended in crushing defeat. And Charles Koch's thoughts at the time are essentially...
By the way, the deputy who failed to engage Parkland shooter gets a $104,000 annual pension for life. It's a travesty that sheds light on public retirement costs in Florida and around the country.
I love that this has become like a talking point again, and these Koch-funded organizations that we have to end public pensions because the guy is getting a pension.
Because a cop didn't want to run into a field of bullets. We should abolish all pensions.
Well, if that doesn't convince you, you're just one of these irrational liberals, envious of wealth.
I will say it's pretty ballsy, because if you can undermine retirement payouts in Florida, you can do it anywhere.
All right, so essentially they get crushed in the 1980 election, and then this changes their outlook, where Jane Mayer quotes Charles Koch as saying something to the effect of, politicians are all just puppets reading from a script. I want to change the script they read from. So, and I'm paraphrasing there, but essentially you see what happens with the Cato Institute. The Kochs are also, as well as other billionaires, big funders of the American Enterprise Institute, the Heritage Foundation, all these conservative think tanks that are beholden to their donors that publish, studies that, surprise, surprise, always say the rich should keep more of their money, environmental regulations are bad, unions are bad, et cetera, that always reflect the bottom line interests of their donors. So not only do they set up these think tank networks, particularly in the Koch's case, the Cato Institute, but they go on an educational campaign. And before we get to the Clinton administration thing, I do just want to give a quick overview of essentially the Koch brothers took over George Mason University. It was a public university in Virginia.
Right.
And their strategy for taking over public universities, because they're not the first billionaires to come up with the idea, but they really perfected it, where they realized that if you set up your own little crank university in the middle of nowhere, nobody will really give a shit. Mm-hmm. The key is instead you find like a prestigious institute like Stanford, for example, and then you set up what is called a private academic center there. So just for context on Stanford, they have what's called the Hoover Institute, which is a private academic center that promotes free market ideas, named after the worst president of the 20th century, who destroyed the economy and starved thousands of Americans to death by his refusal to do anything about the Great Depression caused by the very free market policies that is now advocated by the Hoover Institute. So it is really...
You know what was also named after Hoover? Shanty towns from people who were evicted from their houses during the Great Depression.
It is really the conservative version of reclaiming a racial slur by saying, hell yeah, we're Hooverists. We want all of you to starve to death. But yes, so the Hoover Institute is one of these private academic centers. It's on the Stanford campus. And what happens is private donors will approach... I guess Stanford's a private college, but they'll do this with public colleges too, where they'll approach the administration there and be like, hey, we'll set up a private academic center, and they'll study something that seems non-controversial like economics. But because their funding comes with strings, so they will have control over faculty hirings and these kinds of things. So their economics research will, for some reason, always support bottom-line interests. And so...
Once again, a lot of words for propaganda.
Yes. Right. But so interesting thing that happened with the George Mason University, which again there was a recent story about how the Koch brothers were exercising hiring and firing decisions over faculty at this publicly funded university.
And what happened here was that basically some students who wanted to uncoke their school, which fun phrase, play on uncock, is they basically filed a Freedom of Information Act on their, or some equivalent to that. They basically sued their school to get them to release basically documents relating to the...
I thought the people who wanted to uncoke their schools were the ones you never want at fraternity parties.
They got documents that were basically the agreements between the Koch brothers and or the Charles and David Koch's foundations that detailed what the conditions were. And in a 2003 agreement, Mercatus Institute said it. I guess Mercatus Institute is that's the...
Yes, so we're jumping ahead. But yes, the Mercatus Institute is the private academic center the Koch set up at George Mason University, which, again, we explained how these agreements work, but eventually its tentacles kind of slithered into the rest of the university.
Yeah. And it received $900,000, and it was conditional on the appointment of Russell Roberts, who is an economist who advocates limited government.
Mm-hmm.
And in response to this being released, Angel Cabrera, who is both the Koch Foundation and George Mason president...
Isn't he also a shortstop?
When asked about this, he pointed out that the arrangements were old.
Old?
Yeah, that was his excuse. It's like, it was a long time ago. You know, it was 2003. We were going into Iraq. We didn't know if the world was going to end.
It's a different time after 9/11. You know, we were all so scared of terrorism. We had to take over private universities to promote bottom-line propaganda.
Yeah. There were similar things at Florida State University. And apparently a professor at Arizona State University described drama involving a 2014 Koch Foundation. The Kochs demanded that they hire a new professor dedicated to teaching the history of capitalism, which I thought it would have been fun if that were David Harvey. He's very good at that. And the professor said that the university dean told him ASU will never hire anyone that Koch doesn't approve. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. So essentially, yes, they set up this Mercatus Center. I guess this is Latin for markets.
Yeah.
So it's the Latin for Markets Center, which of course promotes, again, their bottom line interests. But the center shares a building with another thing they set up, the Institute for Humane Studies. And Jane Mayer says that Charles Koch was obsessed with like metrics and data, where he was essentially trying to graph the indoctrination of students in real time. So what they did was this Institute for Humane Studies, which shared a building with the Mercatus Center, applicants would have to write application essays, of course, and so the IHS would run them through a computer, which would count the number of references to Ayn Rand and Milton Friedman in order to apply sabermetrics to the ideology. It's like that's what the Kochs figured out is really on-base percentage is much more important than your simple conservative average. It's like a walk is a walk.
Right.
It's like a hit.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah. But the so again, Jane Mayer says that the Charles
they use game theory to teach game theory.
Jane Mayer says the Charles Koch Foundation.
Don't hate the game theory, hate the game.
The Charles Koch Foundation sponsored more than 307 different college market programs as of 2015.
Wow.
So again, they're setting up these academic centers, they're setting up these free market programs, and they're always kind of disguising it where they never say, pro-free market. Well, I mean, they might have kind of a euphemism, but they're always trying to present it as a business school or an economics course or just any way to kind of like make it not look like a blatantly ideological project.
And between 2005 and 2015, they spent $150 million, which if the two brothers are worth $60 billion each, that is a drop in the bucket.
If that.
Yeah.
And by the way, tell your friends because we would love to take that kind of money from the Kochs to shut this podcast down. And so if we get enough listeners, we can leverage that and say, we'll take the pressure off a bit if you just if you just pay us out and we'll walk away.
Listen,
we'll start shredding magic cards on my Instagram. It'll be a new life.
We think that the microeconomics idea of applying game theory to actual human interactions, which reduces a human to a simple agent that just wants to get more of something, and that's the basis of microeconomics, essentially, is to reduce...
A simple human who just wants to get more pornography to show to their employees.
That humans are rational actors who simply want to get more, and that model can explain all of human behavior. We're against that, but we can be convinced for a cool $200,000 per Grubstaker.
Ironically enough, I'm not the first person to observe this, but kind of the rational actors idea that politicians are like corrupted and these kind of thing. All people are rational actors that self-maximize. This was really promoted by again conservative economics departments. Well, they kind of ignored the fact that themselves, as rational actors, would of course be corrupted by the philosophy with the most money behind it, and go on to promote this philosophy that, of course, advocates government to completely stop all regulations, basically. But one more fun fact about the Mercatus Center before we get into the legal proceeding that really gave the Koch brothers a change of heart on their involvement with the Republican Party. But Jane Mayer says that, and I might be misquoting here, but I believe the Mercatus Center became kind of like a direct think tank for the Charles Koch's bottom line interests, where George W. Bush received a list of regulations to eliminate from the Mercatus Center, and I believe eliminated 14 of the 28 suggestions, just verbatim. So again, it's like you set up an ideology factory, and then you sponsor politicians, and then you get your way. I mean, it's an assembly line of propaganda. But
that story fits neatly into the liberal narrative that the Koch brothers, Charles and David, have used their inherited oil wealth to fund the development of radical economic theories at Koch-funded universities. But Stephen Pearlstein, a Washington Post columnist, for the past 7 years he's been a professor at Mason, and although he teaches economics and economic policy, he's not a member of the economics department. They wouldn't have him. And it turns out that Mason's economic department, they're actually just very libertarian in their mindset. And so they seek out donations from people who are like-minded.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Keeping it within the community.
Yeah, says the guy who's not allowed into their economics department.
It's interesting. I really respect his ability to just take all that money to promote bottom-line interests of people and then not be corrupted by those people. Sure. He's just a free thinker.
Well, on every block within the campus, there's a button, of course, if you feel threatened. There's one button, and then underneath that button, there's another one if you see Steven.
Yeah. Just like a giant red button that says "push here" if you see Paul Krugman on campus. I think Jane Mayer also quotes. It was like some sort of high school actually was broke, and it had to take a deal from the Koch Foundation, which involved textbooks that would declare that Franklin Roosevelt made the Depression worse through the New Deal. And, labor laws were like stealing from poor people and these sorts of things.
I hate to bring up, but literally propaganda.
Yeah.
They operate on screwing over everyday people and then convincing them that they didn't screw them over.
Yeah. Well, again, and it's just like, it's kind of a fascinating thing where...
God, it's so fucked.
Yeah, well, it's essentially fascinating where it's like you have like these Alex Jones and all these people with, the various conspiracy theories, and it's like... again, I'm not the first person to make this point, but these conspiracy theories are...
But you are the last person to make this point.
I am the most recent person you have heard make this point. The conspiracy theories are popular because people recognize that they don't have control over their own government and all these forces are aligned against them. But it turns out it's not like the Illuminati lizards. It's just the people at the top 10 of the fucking Forbes list, where you have the Koch brothers spending almost as much as the major political parties on their own political organization. And that's just in the actual political lobbying side. They are also pouring hundreds of millions into education efforts to turn out ideological soldiers. And again, like as somebody who graduated with a BA in economics, there were certainly aspects of that ideology that bled into mainstream economics courses, even though I got a rather Keynesian economics education, but I still had, for example, Marxist labor theory of value misdescribed to me by somebody who was a teacher who was trying to pre-bias
Name names.
Yes.
Which eventually trickled down into your Facebook posts.
That's right. When are you going to get to them lies that you talked about a while ago?
Which lies?
The amount of times they lied to people?
Oh, yeah. So we'll get into that now.
Right.
So basically, what happens is, as we mentioned, Charles Koch, he's like, fuck politics. Reagan's a sellout. I'm not donating to the Republicans. I'm going to change the script that these puppets are acting with.
Fuck bitches get money.
Exactly. And this is why he's funding all these these private academic centers. This is why he's funding the Cato Institute to change the script. But that changes in the 1990s, particularly 99, because the Clinton administration launches an investigation into the egregious pollution practices of Koch Industries. And what happens in 1999 is a jury finds Koch Industries guilty of making more than 24,500 false claims to the government. And this is basically just lying about oil spills, lying about...
That's 300 oil spills.
300 oil spills.
From its pipelines and oil facilities in 6 different states. This includes a pipeline explosion that incinerated 2 teenagers.
What?
Cool.
Yeah.
Were they both dudes or chicks or one of both?
I remember this story. Yes. So basically what happens is like... it's like...
they were driving out to make out landing.
Yeah. It was... What happens is... I forget the gas, but basically this father... his daughter and her friend were over in their trailer park. He was watching sports. This is from Jane Mayer's book. And so they smell a weird thing because there's a pipeline underneath them that has burst, and it is leaking some sort of gas. But basically, the kids get the idea to drive out and try and check up on it, and they take the truck out and they drive up, and then they stop, and then when they reignite the car, it explodes in a fireball because all of this gas is leaking up from the pipeline. And Koch Industries later settled with the family, but not before, smearing them. And
deny.
Exactly.
I like how these 2 teenagers were more responsible than the fucking corporation that put the goddamn gas underneath them.
Yeah, Koch Industries, we we make teenagers flaming hot. That should be the Koch medical beauty products. We'll make you as hot as we made those 2 teenagers. But
so how many lies was it again?
Well, they killed 2 people there. Oh, sorry, the lies.
Yeah.
More than 24,500 lies to government investigators. And that's as a jury found them guilty of
It's
this
like they were
in
dating
1999.
the government.
Yes. A jury found them guilty of this in 1999. Another story from Jane Mayer's book is that an employee would testify in that trial that management regularly, at Koch Industries, regularly ordered him to dump toxic waste down drains.
Oh, my God.
Like, just like, tap water drains, basically. And again, these are horrifically pollutant chemicals.
I think the craziest thing about the podcast is learning about the evil things billionaires do. It's horribly monstrous, corrupt things, but there are these smaller, petty things that I'm more bothered by, because it's like you can't operate in a shitty, evil way and not be a dick. Like, you can't be like, hey, hundreds of thousands of people we're going to be killed by what we do, but also I kick puppies. Like, come on.
Mm-hmm. Counterpoint.
People believe that all these goodies we have today just appear.
Right.
That appear out of the sky because we get spoiled. And that's what I say. The worst enemy of success is success. When you become prosperous enough, you take it for granted.
Yeah.
And you forget what's required to make people's lives better, your own and others.
That's right. You guys think we should stop blowing up teenagers? Well, say goodbye to those big buildings.
If you stop blowing up teenagers, you forget where you came from. Success.
Think about all the Dixie cups we'd have to stop making if we wanted all the teenagers to live.
But essentially, the EPA imposes a multi-million-dollar fine on them. I don't believe anyone actually goes to prison for this. But the EPA slaps a big fine on them.
It was the largest up till then.
Right.
The charges resulted in a guilty plea and a $20 million penalty.
Oh. Well, they never did it again.
Oh, wait, $30 million penalty.
But so this really is what sets them off on the path towards Republican politics. Because, again, until this point, they've been satisfied to try and set the script. But here they're like, oh, the government will actually fuck with our bottom line interests, so we have to align ourselves with the Republican Party. So it is, as we mentioned...
They're going to fuck with us, so let's fuck with them first.
Right. So they become a big donor to and supporter of the George W. Bush presidency. As we mentioned, the Bush administration took regulations to eliminate directly from the Mercatus Center that they run. The
W stands for vulnerable.
Right. But I guess we should really jump to the Obama administration, because this is where they come into their own.
Thanks, Obama.
Yes. So we mentioned on the previous episode that their summit, their semi-annual summit, where they gather all these multi-billionaires and millionaires together and, kind of lobby them to donate to their political network, which in turn ships money out to all these different conservative advocacy groups. Started in 2003, but it wasn't until 2009 with the election of Barack Obama that it really took off. There were, again, according to Jane Mayer, more than 18 billionaires at their January 2009 summit. People like Paul Singer, who we did the 2 episodes ago, he sent a representative. The Mercers, Rebecca Mercer, she was there. Well, I don't know if she was at that one, but she attended one of the summits. So the point is, a lot of different billionaires get involved in this because they're trying to fight the Obama agenda, which initially seems like it will be hostile to their bottom line interests. And what happens is the Tea Party breaks out, and this is partly a semi-grassroots response to, the bank bailouts and all that stuff. But the Charles Koch super PAC, Charles and David Koch, Americans for Prosperity, becomes a big financial backer of the Tea Party movement. So it's kind of like some citizens turned out, but they recognized this opportunity to astroturf their own interests onto this movement. And it should be noted that the Tea Party was also partly motivated by racial animosity towards Barack Obama. But
what? No.
Because he was half white.
Yes. But so, like...
Can't have that cracker in office ruining things.
But basically, Americans for Prosperity goes to Tea Party rallies, and it sets up rallies where it, chooses the featured speakers, who, of course, promote Koch Brothers' bottom line interests. It gives out talking points. It gives out free American for Prosperity T-shirts. Like, Jane Mayer tells a story about some person being pissed off that basically these volunteers paid by the Kochs showed up at a Tea Party rally, gave some people Americans for Prosperity T-shirts, took a picture of them with them, and then left. And they were like, oh, yeah, they're just sending that back to the Kochs to show that they're doing something.
Oh, my God.
I But so basically, and they also give these protesters like lists of representatives and government officials to contact. And, you know, surprise, surprise, the Koch brothers' bottom line interest is much different than the actual grassroots movement. Because, as we mentioned, you know, they've been trying for so long to find this grassroots movement to embrace all their libertarian principles. And then finally, with the election of Obama, they have some foot soldiers, and they try to shape the message as much as possible. And just like one more thing on this, according to Jane Mayer, one study found that not one Tea Party protester could be found who was in favor of privatizing Social Security. So it's just like, again, you have these grassroots protesters, which, you know, some of them are racist, some of them are misguided, some of them are whatever, but it's really just an attempt by billionaires to astroturf a campaign onto their newly emerging foot soldiers, and they use their multi-billion dollars to do that. Just like another example, FreedomWorks was a Koch Brothers affiliated. FreedomWorks was a Koch Brothers affiliated Republican PAC that had a secret deal with Glenn Beck, giving him $1 million a year to plug them on air without disclosing that he was receiving money from them. And the Americans for Prosperity,
he's friends with Samantha Bee, right?
Yes.
He went to Burning Man.
But, you know, and we'll talk a bit about more on the George Soros episode, Glenn Beck's talking about how George Soros is the puppet master. Well, of course, he is receiving $1 million a year from the actual puppet masters. But so American for Prosperity sets up a similar deal with conservative radio host Mark Levin, who later trashed, I believe it was Politico, who exposed this deal. But again, you know, Mark Levin becomes like one of these angry talk show hosts like Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, et cetera, who's really whipping up the Tea Party movement, all the while he's taking money from Americans for Prosperity to plug and promote them on air without disclosing that he is receiving financial assistance from them. So the Tea Party movement is really where the Koch brothers get their foot soldiers. And but it's Citizens United that really changes the whole game.
See you.
Mm-hmm. And let's see. I guess we should talk.
Do you have anything about the relation between the Koch brothers and the Iraq War?
I don't actually know their position on that, no.
I think I've got one thing.
Bring it up.
Something must be done. War would mean a prohibitive increase in our taxes.
Hey, I got an uncle lives in Texas.
No, I'm talking about taxes, money, dollars.
Dallas. That's where my uncle lives. Dallas, Texas.
But so yeah, it's
so
like
pretty anti-war.
Well, it's another interesting thing where it's like they're supposed to be libertarians or whatever, and David Koch, you know, even like attends the RNC and like says, you know, gay marriage should be legal. But of course, all their money is primarily concerned with their bottom line interests, so they have no problem supporting. You know, I don't know if they are anti-war, but they have no problem supporting pro-war politicians or anti-gay marriage politicians as long as they'll say, yeah, we'll gut the EPA or whatever. And so what happens is
we're for gay marriage as long as it's not our brother.
What happens is I should talk about donor-advised funds. So we've talked a little bit about
pro-gay marriage, anti-gay brother.
We've talked a little bit about private foundations and what a scam they are. So what happens is in 1999, an organization called Donors Trust is set up by a libertarian named Whitney Ball, who had helped oversee the development of the Cato Institute. Donors Trust is a 501c3, and it's a, quote, donor-advised fund. And basically what it does is that private foundations and people who want to protect their privacy when they're giving to conservative groups can give to this donor-advised fund, and then it will redistribute their money to conservative groups. Again,
like a mutual fund charity?
Basically, think...
Yeah, a little bit.
Right. So it's like Jane Mayer describes it as like Russian nesting dolls, where the money starts in like a philanthropic...
It's a money laundering operation.
Right. The money starts in a philanthropic foundation, then it goes into Donors Trust, and then Donors Trust redistributes it to conservative political action organizations. Jane Mayer says that between 1999 and 2015, Donors Trust distributed more than $750 million to conservative groups, and its largest donation in 2010 was $7.4 million back to Americans for Prosperity. So that Koch brothers PAC. So essentially, it's just a way of protecting their identities, and this is a big mechanism that they used in their push for global warming denial. But yes,
and the Koch brothers do like to play themselves up as like big philanthropists.
Oh, of course. All billionaires do, when a lot of them are engaged in this kind of shady shit.
What's interesting is I looked at their philanthropy website, and they list 4 different philanthropies. The first one is the Micro Works Foundation, which they say is through scholarship for the they're using it to they're basically they describe it as CEO of the foundation, Micro spends a significant amount of time speaking about the country's dysfunctional relationship with work. So basically, the foundation, I looked at their tax return, it's worth about $600,000. They're basically paying Micro money to go around talking about the need for improved working, basically they're paying Micro to talk. And out of that...
Looks like he's doing a dirty job.
Out of that, they got this like amazing interview where he talks to Charles Koch and basically plays up how like down to earth he is. Like there's this.
The problem with poor people, they're not willing to do the dirty job of fueling the Nazi war machine.
They
look, polluting the environment, specifically the air, water, and earth. It's a dirty job.
Look, nobody says it's a glamorous job telling people that they're going to take a shower and then putting Zyklon B into the chamber in which they are showering. But, these jobs are necessary, and people got to get over the idea that they can make it as an artist. You should be an Einsatzgruppen instead. That's what the market wants. Fucking Micro piece of shit.
Here's one of the most telling segments of this.
The part where our Venn diagrams overlap is the skilled trades.
Oh, absolutely. These are underserved skills, tremendous need. In the recent years, the cost of doing a project, particularly on the Gulf Coast, has gone up 50% and taken much longer. And it's because we don't have enough skilled people to do that, whether that's carpenters, welders, electricians, mechanics. And so we've been working with these trade schools and others and subsidizing them and supporting them.
It seems so. Like my takeaway from that is that Charles Koch wants to put money into the skilled trades through Micro to lower his bottom line,
right?
Basically, to make the cost of buying people with skilled trades cheaper.
His wages are too high.
Yeah.
My takeaway was maybe we don't have enough skilled people because your father helped kill 12 million of them. But yes, so Citizens United really, and subsequent court rulings, really opens the floodgates because, again, there was, McCain-Feingold and some other campaign finance restrictions. But Citizens United essentially, and subsequent legal rulings, sets up the ability of donors to spend unlimited amounts on outside groups. And so what these are often called are social welfare groups that hide their donors' identities. These are 501c4s. One interesting part of 501c4s, again, I'm relying on Jane Mayer for this, they can't be majority political activity, but what happens is lawyers argue as long as 49% of it is political activity, it's not majority political activity. And again, because of the shell game, the Center to Protect Patient Rights, which was a Koch, among others, funded conservative group that opposed Obamacare, it claimed in 2010 to the IRS that it spent, quote, no money on political activity, when in reality it transferred more than $103 million to other conservative groups.
Wow.
So again, it's just a fucking shell game. And one more illustrative statistic that Jane Mayer got was in 2006, these kinds of outside groups accounted for only 2% of political spending, whereas in 2010, the wave midterm election, it was more than 40%. Jeez. So essentially, Citizens United unleashed the Koch brothers to become the third major political party.
I can see why Penn and Teller love them so much, because they're really good at that sort of ball and cup
and
sleight of hand.
Yes, and so again, 2010 is a wave election, and I just want to play a short sample of an advertisement, if we could. An advertisement that was run in Iowa that was partly funded by the Koch networks against a Democrat in Iowa.
Remember, this is Iowa where this is being played.
For centuries, Muslims built mosques where they won military victories. Now, they want to build a mosque at ground zero, where Islamic terrorists killed 3,000 Americans. It's like the Japanese building at Pearl Harbor. Building the mosque believes America was partly responsible for 9/11 and is raising millions overseas from secret donors. But incredibly, Bruce
Secret
Braley
donors are bad.
supports building a mosque at ground zero. Tell Braley what you think.
I hate
that strong Iowa position of supporting a mosque at ground zero.
I really hate to inform this ad, but as someone who has visited Pearl Harbor recently, mostly Japanese tourists. But yes, that kind of like race baiting, Islamophobic ad. And interestingly enough, the guy who came up with that ad, I believe his name is Kenny McCarthy, my estranged father. But he's also the guy who did the Michael Dukakis ad about furloughs for black criminals and stuff.
Oh, the Willie Horton stuff?
Yes, he did the Willie Horton ads, and so, of course, he also came up with these Islamophobic post-9/11 ads, which they ran all across the country against various Democrats to get them defeated using race-baiting Islamophobia. But so, essentially, this is what hundreds of millions of dollars in political spending gets you. And... excuse me. But in the 2010 and 2012 election, they coordinate with Karl Rove, sets up his own group like this, Crossroads USA. I believe in, I guess before we skip ahead to 2012, we should just mention 2010. 2010 is a wave election against Obama, funded by hundreds of millions of dollars in Koch Brothers contributions. And once they win power, they launch this redistricting effort thought of first by Ed Gillespie, among others, called Red Map, where they go into all these different places where they have just won victories by spending, in some cases, millions of dollars on local races, millions of dollars of outside funds, and then they get their newly elected people to help set up redistricting operations. And I just want to talk a couple things. In North Carolina, they set up redistricting operations under the Red Map strategy, but they also set up photo ID voting laws and other ways to try and disenfranchise voters.
They really bought into the Karl Rove sort of playbook,
right?
Of like trying to win it all at the county level.
Yes.
In order to build the kind of constituencies you need that you could pour money into to take on bigger state and federal campaigns.
Right. And so just a couple things. In North Carolina in particular, which they Jane Mayer calls kind of like an experimental lab for them, they redistricted heavily. And like, I'll post a photo of one of these gerrymandered districts, but it looks like Ebola under a fucking microscope. It's just crazy. But when they took over North Carolina, they of course refused to expand Medicaid under Obamacare. Medicaid expansion. And interesting note is that a Harvard study estimated that in North Carolina alone, 400 to 1,100 people died every year because of the refusal to expand Medicaid.
Oh my God.
So it's interesting where it's like they're running all these ads about 9/11 where they're doing a mini 9/11 every 3 years.
Yeah, and
fucking murderers.
Social activist Petey Pablo was quoted as saying, North Carolina, come on and raise up, take your shirt off, and spin around your head like a helicopter.
And just one other thing on this voting disenfranchisement.
Yeah, but they had the choice to choose their medical provider.
After they took over all these local state governments, Jane Mayer says that 37 different photo ID laws were proposed in different states, in 37 different states between 2011 and 2012. So essentially, they took over in a wave election, spending hundreds of millions of dollars, and then they were like, we're going to stay in power now. All right, so essentially, in 2010, they win this midterm election, and then they're like, what's next? Well, of course, next is the presidency. That's what they didn't have.
Right.
And so, interestingly enough, and again, this reflects the wider Republican shift on global warming, and it's entirely a result of Citizens United, where this unlimited money... they line up eventually behind Mitt Romney. They wanted like Chris Christie first, but he was horribly corrupt, so didn't run.
Too corrupt for the Coke industries, Chris Christie.
But basically, in Romney's 2010 book, he writes that global warming is a serious threat. And then suddenly, when he starts taking Coke money, he famously at the RNC says that Obama promised to stop the rising oceans. sarcastically,
Oh,
and then he's
wow.
like, "But I'm going to help you and your family," or
Oh,
whatever.
my God.
And he later on the campaign trail said that CO2 is not that much of an issue. And again, you can entirely trace this back to Citizens United, where again, in 2008, John McCain ran on global warming's a problem. We're going to do something about it. Newt Gingrich did a joint thing with Nancy Pelosi where she said we're going to do something about global warming. But as of 2012, all of these people and most Republican members of Congress had totally reversed themselves on global warming because the Kochs were, with Citizens United, the third political party. And if you were a Republican and you said global warming is real, you will have a primary challenger with unlimited outside spending. So it's like it's just entirely a material analysis of how material circumstances shape ideology, where Koch Brothers, bottom line industry, took over the Republican Party and made it anti-global warming.
Listen, how can you say that global warming is real and that when I strap my dog to the top of a car driving cross country that it was freezing?
I don't know.
But yes, essentially, they lose in 2012, unfortunately. Jane Mayer describes this interesting story where Obama's political advisor, I think it was that dipshit who went on to work for Theresa May. I think he was Obama's campaign manager.
Howie Mandel?
Yes. But so he sits Obama down at some point and says that outside groups are going to spend more than $660 million against you in 2012. And up to this point, Obama had been against setting up a super PAC. But at this point, he goes, okay, we have to fight them that way. And so they set up a super PAC, and it's just like a big back and forth with money. But ultimately, the Koch brothers lose. We've mentioned on a previous episode, the Obama administration ran some hard ads against Bain Capital, which actually antagonized some of their own donors. But, I'm kind of jumping around here. But it's just interesting the way Wall Street money kind of intersects, where after Obama was kind of critical of the banks, all of the hedge fund billionaires, even the ones, some of them who had previously supported him, went over to the Koch brothers' side. But essentially...
No!
Essentially, they lose in 2012, and this is a soul-searching moment. Because when they lose in 2012, it's partly because of Mitt Romney's, 47% of the country will never vote for us. They're moochers, they're takers, It's partly because of that. And so one of the Koch...
Otherwise, Mitt Romney was an avatar of charisma.
His name was Mitt. He had it in the glove.
So...
Gary Payton was supposed to be his vice president. Glove with the glove.
But so, they take over in 2010. They launch this red map redistricting, but they lose in 2012. It's a setback. Karl Rove melts down on air. Everyone's happy. But the donors are pissed off, and so what they do is they rethink their strategy, where in 2014, at the Koch Brothers semi-annual summit, a guy named Richard Fink, who's their political advisor since the 80s, and if you want to know what a real-life necromancer looks like, just Google image Richard Fink, because, I say this as a pale gentleman, but that man has not seen sun for more than 300 years. He has been deep studying under...
Vampires want his shade.
He's been studying Lee Atwater's copy of the Necronomicon to bring the worst of political strategy to life. But basically, in 2014, they reanalyzed. This is before the 2014 midterms. They reanalyze, and Richard Fink, the meeting... Some of the audio of this meeting leaks, and Richard Fink...
Andy, you got that audio real quick?
Yeah, maybe, but it's apparently not so good quality, but we can take a look.
I just want Andy to make those noises again, sorry.
But so, basically, Richard Fink gives this speech to the donors at the Koch Summit, and he splits America into thirds. He says, a third of the country will always be with us, a third of the country will always be against us.
A third of the country will always be with us.
And then we... have to convince the other third that we care about them. We care about people like them. It's not change the policy. It's change the way we present the policy. And, of course, this would lead into their, as we mentioned on the previous episode, their push for criminal justice reform and all these other kind of humanizing things where they get these, praising profiles in Time magazine.
Now, let's pause for a second and take a step back to what Koch money can basically get. There was this. Were you going to talk about Scott Walker a bit?
No, actually, yes.
So Scott Walker basically was one of the Koch projects. He was brought up as this free market governor of Wisconsin, and once he became governor, he started this very controversial plan to basically make state worker unions illegal. Basically, did everything he could to fight state worker unions. The Democratic part of the Wisconsin state legislature was furious at him about this. One of them complained that he couldn't get through to Scott Walker over the phone after trying repeatedly. And so in the midst of all this guy by the name of Ian Murphy asked himself who could get through to Scott Walker on the phone. And he arrived at Charles Koch. And so apparently by his own account, he had been up 24 hours, was kind of drunk and stoned. And he called Scott Walker's...
Wait a minute, this bit's not funny anymore. I don't like drug users.
He called Scott Walker's office using his publicly listed line and said that he was David Koch, and they put him through to him.
Oh my God.
And then he recorded the whole thing. It's 10 minutes. It's worth the listen, even though Scott Walker just rambles. I wouldn't know anything about that. And he just plays Charles Koch as this comical villain with things like this.
The other thing is I've got layoff notices ready, and we'll probably get 5,000 to 6,000 state workers will get at-risk notices for layoffs.
Beautiful, beautiful. Got to crush that union.
If they think I'm caving, they've been asleep for the last 8 years, and it's because we don't budge. If you're doing the right thing, you stay firm.
And then it gets better than that. Then there's
how could it get better than that?
There's this.
Yell at me for an hour. I'm used to that. I can deal with that, but I'm not negotiating.
Bring a baseball bat. That's what I do.
I have one in my office. You'll be happy with that. I got a slugger with my name on it.
He's talking about negotiating with Democrats, and then he's saying this about the union protests.
Right. We'll back you any way we can. But what we were thinking about the crowds was planting some troublemakers.
The only problem with because we thought about that. The problem with, or my only gut reaction to that would be, is if there was a ruckus caused, is that would scare the public into thinking maybe the governor's got to settle to avoid all these problems.
So he got Scott Walker to basically admit to
they were thinking about staging violent protests.
Yeah. Illegal activities, and then towards the end, there's this beauty.
Well, I'll tell you what, Scott. Once you crush these bastards, I'll fly you out to Cali and really show you a good time.
All right, that would be outstanding. Thanks for all the support and helping us move the cause forward, and we appreciate it. We're doing it the just and right thing for the right reasons, and it's all about getting our freedoms back.
But, in fairness to Scott Walker, he was dealing with the American equivalent of Al-Qaeda public service unions.
So Scott Walker claimed that everything he said was things he would say anyway. And then he claimed that because he rejected using violence, that he was making the right decision. And then he said in his memoir that it was a message from God to be more humble.
Wow.
Oh, that's cool.
And then another Koch project, real quick here, was Governor Sam Brownback of Kansas, who has been supported by the Kochs for his entire career. And when he was elected governor, he brought in the largest tax cuts in Kansas state history. And Kansas, as a result, lost hundreds of millions in revenue. And so as a result, Brownback cut spending and services. And then in June 2017, towards the end of his tenure as governor, the Kansas legislature rolled back his tax cuts. This is a Republican legislature. They had to roll back Brownback's tax cuts, kind of undoing his whole project. And then he was appointed under Trump to the United States Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom. And at that time, he made a statement about, or he criticized state buildings for being in a terrible state of disrepair, and had no self-awareness that that was what he caused after 8 years.
What a fucking dipshit.
Yeah.
All right, I want to circle back to Richard Fink, though, because they get crushed in 2012, and then they have this soul-searching moment where they start quoting Martin Luther King and talking about prison reform and stuff. But so Richard Fink, their political strategist, is quoted as this 2014 summit, splitting Americans into thirds and saying, he actually does admit, he says to them on this leaked audio recording, quote, "We want to decrease regulations. Why? Because we can make more profit, okay?" Where he's basically saying we have to figure out a new way to sell this to people, you know, and they eventually come up with freedom and all these kinds of stuff. Well, that's always been their idea. But my favorite quote from this is he says that the minimum wage denied at this 2014 Koch summit, he says the minimum wage, quote, denied an opportunity for earned success to 500,000 Americans that he believes would be willing to work for less than $7.25 an hour. And he said because they don't have jobs, they've, quote, lost their meaning in life, and that this was, quote, a very big part of recruitment in Germany during the 1920s, and that minimum wage laws help support conditions that would, quote, lead to the rise and fall of the Third Reich. And you know who doesn't help support conditions that would lead to the rise and the fall of the Third Reich is people with the last name Koch. But yeah, no, I guess we're just kind of jumping around, and unfortunately we can't cover everything.
I will say that from my research into things, that I did find out that all of the Koch brothers, including Frederick, do not eat butt. So, sorry world, the Koch don't do butt.
But Bill does honk a bike horn into the butt.
That's right, yes. Out of respect.
And another thing about the Koch's criminal justice reform push, there was the big thing that made headlines in 2015 was there was this bipartisan criminal justice reform bill. It was called the Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act.
Mm-hmm.
And it was supported by the Koch brothers. You know, they were behind it. They went on this big PR blitz. It was hailed as this thing that both Obama and the Kochs supported. If you read through like some of the provisions of the act, apparently it was just like really minor things like reducing mandatory minimums from like life sentences for the third strike rule to 20 years, something like that. But they made a huge thing about it. And then just as the act was about to go through, Koch Industries, through Senator Orrin Hatch, shoved in what's called the Mens Rea Reform Act, in which you have to prove intent for white-collar criminals when prosecuting them for a crime, basically making it almost impossible to prosecute white-collar criminals because, you know, you have fraud, but you also have, in addition to proving fraud, which is incredibly difficult, you have to prove that they were knowingly committing fraud.
Right.
And Republicans basically said, you know, either this goes in or we're not voting for the whole Criminal Reform Act. The whole thing got torpedoed and basically just died in the Senate. And that's basically the criminal justice reform legacy of the Koch brothers.
That's what Martin Luther King Jr. would have wanted. But so I guess we should talk a little bit more while we have time on some of the reasons the Kochs might be interested in making white-collar prosecution more difficult. I just want to tell the story again. This is from Jane Mayer's book about a man named Donald Carlson who worked for the Kochs since 1974. He was cleaning out tanks that contained leaded gasoline, often, you know, scrubbing them down by hand and these kinds of things. The OSHA,
I think they're called Panzers.
The OSHA, OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration or whatever it is, but the Workplace Safety Administration of the federal government mandated in the late 70s that companies that were exposing workers to benzene poisoning, possible benzene poisoning, has to offer them annual blood tests and tell them if abnormalities are found. Donald Carlson underwent these tests, but they started showing that his blood count his blood cell counts were abnormal, seriously abnormal. In 1990, 1992, 1993, Koch Industries does not tell him until 1994. They fire him after he becomes too sick to work in 1995. He dies of leukemia in 1997. They settle with his widow out of court on condition of no written agreement. Charles Koch has, of course, called these kinds of government regulations, quote, socialistic. So, yes, the Koch Industries murders their employees. They murder teenagers. A small town in Crosset, Arkansas, 11 of the 15 households there had cancer in the late 2000s.
11 of the 15?
There were 15 households.
Oh
11 of them had family members have cancer. They believed it was caused by chemical waste dumped by the nearby paper mill owned by Koch Industries. The air stank so bad people would not leave their houses without respirators. There was a USA Today story, and actually the EPA administrator under Obama made some noise about an investigation into this, but unsurprisingly, after the Koch funded 2010 midterm, Republicans became adamant about gutting the EPA's budget, and in fact, the Senate eventually passed a bill to reduce the EPA's budget by 16%, as according to Jane Mayer, after the 2010 midterms. So essentially, as we've mentioned, once the Clinton verdict was rendered, they became obsessed with destroying the EPA and protecting their bottom line interests by making it as hard as possible for the EPA to do its job, and you can see why, because they're poisoning people and poisoning their employees. Yeah.
Well, I don't think this is a good billionaire. I don't think...
Well, wait. Let's... to go out, here is a clip from the documentary Park Avenue, where it's an interview with one of the doormen from 720 Park Avenue, where David Koch lives. And he talks about what it's like to be a doorman for David Koch.
When I started at 740, I was like, this is great, come around to Christmas time, I'm going to get 1,000 from each resident, because they are multi-billionaires. But it's not that way, These guys are businessmen. They know what the going rate is. They're not going to give you anything more than that. The cheapest person overall was David Koch.
Wow.
We would load up his trucks, 2 vans usually, every weekend for the Hamptons. Multiple trips, multiple guys, in and out, heavy bags. We would never get a tip from Mr. Koch. We would never get a smile from Mr. Koch. $50 check for Christmas. A check too, yeah. At least you could give us cash.
So, fun follow-up on that from Jane Meyer's story. When PBS aired that Park Avenue documentary, David Koch resigned from the WNET board of NY Public Television and told one friend about the film, quote, "It's going to cost them $10 million. So,
what? He just said, fuck y'all, I'm taking my money away from you after that?
Yeah, basically.
Wow, what a fucking real piece of work. This dude sucks.
Yeah. And I guess just like while we're winding down here, one other fun story. Charles Koch's son, a man named Chase, in high school, ran a red light in Kansas and killed a 12-year-old boy. He pleaded guilty to vehicular manslaughter, and he was sentenced to, I believe, 100 hours of community service, probation, and ordered to pay for the boy's funeral. So, justice.
But not the most expensive casket or the nicest location or even a burial plot.
He was ordered to write the family a $50 check after they had helped unload his Christmas supplies. And Chase Koch, with no self-awareness, Charles talked about how his son had really worked his way up in the company and has since, I believe, been promoted to president of the fertilizer portion of Koch Industries. So,
wow. One of the other Koch kids makes these designer shirts.
Yeah, this is going around the internet.
The XL designer shirts, and in one of his promo videos for these shirts, he's talking about who could wear it where, and these shirts are horrendous, by the way. They're shirts that have outlandish, outrageous designs, and nobody logical would ever wear them, but he's talking about where people wear them. Like, you can wear them in the boardroom, the discoteca, the yacht, and it's like... Fat billionaires? You're selling this fat billionaires? That's what you're trying to do?
What's great, too, is that kid also looks just like Kim Jong-un.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
There's a I was thinking, so the guy who had to pay for the funeral, I can just imagine him in the funeral parlor where they're like, and this is our premium casket, and he's like, yeah, but do you have something cheaper? And they're like, well, I mean, this is our kind of lower end. It's not that great. And he's like, yeah, okay, I'll take that one. And then you cut to the funeral, and the pallbearers are carrying the kid, and then the bottom comes out, and the kid hits the ground.
Did you know? All right, we get it. Did you know he changed his name to Chase after he chased down that kid? Oh, man. But yeah, I mean, I guess kind of the summary here is that the Koch brothers and their affiliated network of millionaires and billionaires, again, the Mercers were big sponsors of this. They've really become a political party unto themselves who spent, more than $880 million in 2016, almost as much as the Republican and Democratic parties each spent. So they are the third political party in America. And it's so important that people understand how, all these different ideological things are tied into the self-serving, bottom line, anti-global warming, anti-regulation, anti-EPA, whatever interests of a small group of millionaires and billionaires.
When it comes to reality, although people have cancer, the actual family of cancer is the Koch family. They truly are a tumor and a parasite.
Hey, how much do you think that a 12-year-old boy Chase Koch ran over would fetch on the functioning market for children?
Murray Rothbard system of governance.
Yeah, I guess that is the cost of a 12-year-old boy under Murray Rothbard. The cost of the funeral.
Right.
Oh, man. Well,
so, on that, we're the Grubstakers.
Yes.
I'm Andy Palmer.
I'm Sean P. McCarthy.
Steve Jeffers.
Yogi Pollywall.
And, Koch Industries, you want to buy us out, we'll talk.